Hello and welcome to another edition of Movie Mythbusting with the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. My name is Haley Fenner and I'm excited to talk to you guys today about Liberty's Kids. And specifically, we're going to focus in on one episode from the series that is Across the Delaware. So this episode comes well into the series, but a little bit of background on Liberty's Kids. So Liberty's Kids was produced from 2002 to 2003 and aired on PBS. And it was part of their edutainment historical fiction series. So it follows the events of the American Revolution. And those events are crucial in the story of the main characters, and the main characters play a pretty important role in how things play out. So Liberty's Kids goes from the Boston Tea Party to the signing of the United States Constitution, and it is seen through the lens of three children who all, and their caretaker, who work for Benjamin Franklin's newspaper and publishing businesses. So the main characters that you meet in this show are featured here on the screen. On the left, we see Moses, who is an African-American man who was a former slave who works in Franklin's printing business. And he is sort of an authority over the kids who are in the show. Next to Moses, we see James Hiller, who is a young reporter who is enthusiastic. He's part of the colonial resistance. He is a patriot, and he's learning about the patriot cause throughout the show. Next to him is Henri, who's a French troublemaker, according to the show's site. And he is also learning about the politics of the American Revolution. Next to them, the young woman pictured is Sarah Phillips, who is a loyalist through and through. She will talk about it in many episodes in the show, especially in the episode that we see. And she in the show serves to provide a little bit of understanding into what loyalists who lived in the American colonies might have experienced. And then next to Sarah on the right, we see Benjamin Franklin, kind of easy to spot there. So this television series, like I said, was part of PBS, and as a result is actually pretty well researched. So when we're talking about myth busting, there are certainly things that we can bust and we can prove that are incorrect. But a lot of it really serves to help students understand the American Revolution. And I think it is geared towards a pretty young audience, but it doesn't shy away from some pretty tough issues. But the program that we're talking about today has to do with Washington crossing the Delaware. Now you can see it silhouetted on the screen here. One of the most famous images in, I think, of the American Revolution that came pretty well after, depicts Washington on board a ship as they cross the icy Delaware. So that is the focus of the episode here, but let's talk a little bit about what happened before December of 1776. So this episode opens up here, but what's gone on prior to that? So prior to where this episode begins in December of 1776, the Continental forces aren't doing so hot. So to give a little bit of background, the shot heard around the world, that thing that starts the American Revolution, happens in April of 1775. Now, you might be thinking 1775, but I thought the Declaration of Independence happened in 1776. It's July 4th. Almost every American has that ingrained in their memories. But conflicts started before the Declaration of Independence was adopted. And even before that, George Washington was named commander-in-chief. So we have a few things on the screen that help us, some primary sources and some secondary sources that help us illustrate that point. So in 1775, George Washington took command of the Continental Army. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen here, we can see a portrait of Washington in what will become his Revolutionary uniform, done by Charles Wilson Peel. But prior to the American Revolution, Washington did have military experience, serving it with the British forces in the French and Indian War, and kind of getting a reputation as a general in that conflict. Now, by the time we see these new colonies sort of banding together to stand up against one of the strongest armies in the world, those redcoats, that British army, George Washington is going to be chosen. And on the right-hand side, we see a manuscript. So that is an unpublished letter that's part of our collection. This is from Philadelphia on June 19th of 1775. And this is where Washington is writing back, acknowledging that he has been chosen to take command of the Continental Army. He says, "Dear Jack, I have been called, or I have been called upon by the unanimous voice of pardon me, the colonies to take command of the Continental Army." He says it's an honor that he could never have expected, even though he wore his uniform to the time when they were actually deciding on who would take control. And he writes about how this is going to be his new responsibility, and to take care of Martha and make sure she stays well back home, because he is going to accept this command and, hopefully this isn't a spoiler alert, lead those colonies to victory, thus securing their final independence, and the United States is born. Now, Washington, at the point he accepts this command, does have military experience, but like I said, not necessarily something that's going to be ready to stand up against those British redcoats. Now, the idea of independence being what is driving these former colonies, the thing that unifies them, is really cemented after the event we see depicted in this secondary source by Ferris. So this is a painting that comes years after the events of the summer of 1776, but we see a young Thomas Jefferson. You can also see Ben Franklin here, tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence, which I like to call, personally, one of the most famous breakup letters in history, where those colonies have come together to outline their grievances against the king and the crown and establish themselves as united states, as a union together. So for those who have been serving in this Continental Army, this idea of what the war was for is really secured and is going to be echoed throughout these forces. But here's the problem. We've got this ragtag army who is really having a hard time. By September of 1776, redcoats have taken over New York City, and there have been a number of hardships and losses by Washington and the Continental Army. In fact, they are constantly retreating. And so by the time we get to December of 1776, morale is low, deserting is high. So groups of people who are leaving their station as part of this army, they're leaving. And we see that really things aren't looking great. Victory is not necessarily soon on the horizon for this Continental force. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, we see another manuscript. Now, this manuscript is written by a Virginian named John Chilton, and he served in the 3rd Virginia Infantry Regiments of the Continental Army, and he writes back to his brother. And so this one comes from Brunswick, New Jersey on the 30th of November in 1776. And he writes about his time, his camp life in New York and New Jersey. And in his letters, he talks about just some of the hardships that they endure. He talks about how there aren't a great number of them. And he talks about how they don't necessarily have all the resources that they need. And that these militia, the numbers are sort of dwindling. So we can see from firsthand accounts from those enlisted men, but also broader reports on the Continental Army, that before December of 1776, like I said, things weren't looking so great. So in the episode, it starts, and you see that. There is sort of a flurry of people talking about Washington doing a bad job, talking about how all he's doing is retreating. And that sort of is the sentiment of many Continental soldiers. At this time, there is primary source evidence to support that. So the tone for that is correct. Now, as we move through, in the episode, we meet John Honeyman. So the kids are actually alongside Washington's forces and are able to witness what is going on in this camp. And so the kids hear of a spy who's been captured and is going to be taken to Washington. One of my favorite details in this scene is when the spy is led into Washington's tent, and what is illustrated actually matches what the tent looks like. So I believe it is at the Museum of the American Revolution, where this tent actually still exists today and can be seen. But Washington did have a large tent in which he commanded these forces. So in the episode, John Honeyman, who we see on the screen, is brought into Washington's tent so he can interrogate him himself. And there's where we find out, drum roll please, Honeyman is supposed to have been a double agent. And so Honeyman is pretending to be a traitor to the colonists when really providing Washington with some valuable information. Now, this is where the story got kind of interesting for me, because I know that spying was part of the American Revolution. Washington actually had a reputation for being a spy master. In fact, he had a group of spies that he called the Culper Ring, and they had everything from things like we see in our manuscripts today, where they were sending messages in code. So spying and espionage was an important part of the American Revolution. In fact, one British officer was reported to have said that the Americans didn't outfight, they outspied the British. So I was curious to learn a little bit about John Honeyman. And as it turns out, Honeyman has sort of become a legend in American history that is hotly debated. In fact, I ended up reading a bit from the CIA's website about Honeyman and found out that he sort of was, they call him the spy that never was. So Honeyman is a person who was alleged to have served Washington, but the truth in his role and his role in the success of crossing the Delaware in December on Christmas night of 1776 is still debated. But what I did want to point out is that while Honeyman himself and his role is not, I cannot say yes, it was true or no, it was not. It is something that has sort of been omitted as time is removed. One of the Pulitzer Prize winning book by David Hackett Fisher, I believe, called Washington's Crossing, actually talks nothing about Honeyman. But spies were certainly important to the successes of both British forces and American forces throughout the war. Now, in the episode a little later, we do see that those Hessian troops that Washington planned this attack on after crossing the Delaware were also supposed to have gotten information that Washington was mounting this attack. And as it turns out, that was true. The Hessians who he planned to surprise attack were sort of tipped off, but didn't do anything with that information. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So back to this crossing of the Delaware. Why are they doing it and what's happening? We see Washington in his tent calling in advisors, and he talks about this plan. They meet in his tent and he shows this map, and he talks about adopting Native American techniques where they would sort of use a surprise attack. And he mentions that this is something that they did very successfully, the Native people, in the last war, so in that French and Indian War. So Washington is taking some of their tactics and, as it says in the episode, sort of adding a little bit of his own expertise to it. But Washington's attack was supposed in the episode to be this three-pronged attack, where there would be a group above Trenton, across from it, and then downstream. And if we fact check that, that actually is true. So Washington was planning a three-pronged attack that included three separate river crossings, but in reality, only one actually made it across. So what were they doing? Why were they actually crossing the Delaware? Just to get to the other side? Washington wanted to take his continental forces across the Delaware River to attack an isolated group of Hessian troops in New Jersey. Now, when I'm saying the word Hessians, this is when we're talking about the German troops who were hired by the British to help fight during the American Revolution. So this is who Washington is targeting with this Christmas night attack, with this Christmas night sort of plan where he would cross the Delaware River. So he wanted to do this to get a quick victory at Trenton and try and boost morale, which is what we see portrayed in the episode, that Washington sees this as a way that he can get a quick victory, use surprise to his advantage, and encourage people to stick with him. Remember that group of people who were deserting, and also really boost the morale of those who were alongside him after having to go through a number of retreats at his side. So Washington's plan is to use a collection of cargo boats and ferries to transport men across the Delaware, men and supplies. Now, this does come, they do plan to do this at night. Like I said, across three different crossings. But it becomes a kind of a mess almost immediately. A strong storm came through, which we see in the episode. The drama is built up. We even see a soldier fall overboard. And by 11 o'clock in the evening of 1776, it was snowing and sleeting and almost like a hurricane. And these soldiers are trying to cross with not only men, but they are also carrying a number of cannons. They are carrying artillery with them. So this is Henry Knox and the Continental Army are really trying to take as much as possible across the Delaware to support them for this later surprise attack. Now, this, even in the show and in artworks that depict the crossing of the Delaware, the drama is high. The stakes are high. And then one of the most famous paintings that's actually held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we see Washington crossing the Delaware, standing on board this ship. Ice is coming out of the river, huge dramatic scene. And it likely was fairly intimidating, but the Delaware River at the point where they crossed was only about 300 yards wide. And Washington, who looks incredibly confident here, actually had so many things sort of going wrong. He actually thought about canceling this attack. So in the episode, Sarah, I think, says, she mentions everything that's gone wrong so far. Why are they still going through with this? And it could be mentioning part of this. Now, another thing that is interesting to point out in the episode, I don't have an image here, but we see a number of African-American men who are actually serving and who are helping and who are serving in the Continental Armed Forces. Now, initially, I had to do a little bit of research into that. Black soldiers did fight in the 14th Continental Regiment, and they were actually part of the group who manned the boats as they crossed the Delaware. These men were part of these regiments and did play an important role in the success of the crossing of the Delaware, and you do see that represented in the show with that sort of diversity of soldiers who are on the screen. Now, Washington's attack on, or Washington's crossing of the Delaware, even though parts of it fell through and didn't work out. You know, if we look at this map here of the Delaware River, there were supposed to be 3. He only ends up with 1. It does then set him up to have some success, to actually take over Trenton, and later, um, pardon me, and later, um, um, sort of have some additional progress in the war. So moving to our next slide, we can see that even in the show, the crossings of success, and then they were able to surprise those Hessian forces, and then become victorious at Princeton after taking over in Trenton. Now, when we see Washington in the show come up to these Hessian soldiers, we see one thing that's really easy for me to myth bust is that they are celebrated. They're having Christmas celebrations. At one point, they are singing Silent Night, which is actually a song that had not been written by the time of the American Revolution. So fun fact there. But Washington did take them by surprise. General Rawl, I believe was his name, is seen in the show to have been warned while playing cards, and he sort of ignores this warning, doesn't read it. In reality, it's expected that Rawl was tipped off by some British spies who had been who had sort of infiltrated Washington's intelligence, and they did pass that information along, but it said that Rawl sort of scoffed, sort of balked at it, didn't really do anything about it. And then later, Rawl actually receives a mortal wound during this actual armed attack against the Hessians here in Trenton. I do believe he also was found with a note in his jacket that did warn him about the attack. But results after this, it was that sort of quick morale boost that Washington expected and hoped it would be. And 2 days after this, so this is happening on December 25th up into the morning of December 26th. So 2 days after the start of this, Washington is actually granted special powers for 6 months to raise troops and supplies. And this is a big deal that Congress is allowing Washington this sort of unprecedented role, that for 6 months he can take actions to actually get the supplies he needs and the people that he needs. I will say, though, that in our collection, we do have a manuscript from Washington that comes in January of 1777, and he still talks about a number of deserters and how hard it is to take measures to sustain this army. In the show, we also see Washington makes this big statement about people then, who will be paid and have sort of like a bonus to stay and to re-enlist and stay alongside him. So we see Washington is taking actions to try and bolster the army and grow it and sustain it. And this might have given them sort of the little shot that they needed to keep going. I am going to spoil it for y'all. Washington did run into a lot of hardships, but eventually, spoiler, Washington did succeed, and the United States did win that war. One thing that's interesting, I forgot to mention about the crossing of the Delaware, I forgot to mention the gentleman pictured here, James Monroe, was actually present. He was actually part of that crossing of the Delaware. He was wounded at the Battle of Trenton, but this future president was part of that Revolutionary War. So for anybody I know that was really fast, but for anyone who is interested in learning more, I recommend 2 sources wholeheartedly. Go check out George Washington's Mount Vernon. You can view their website at mountvernon.org. They have a number of sources on Washington's spy ring, Washington crossing the Delaware. There's a great, I believe it's about 25 minutes film about the winter that led to this crossing of the Delaware. And then if you're looking for something to read, so for any adults, highly recommend this Pulitzer Prize winning book by David Hackett Fisher, Washington's Crossing, a phenomenal in-depth look at Washington's efforts and crossing the Delaware River, one of the things that is really part of Washington's legacy. So with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. And check out our calendar at virginiahistory.org/events to view more movie myth busting. We have been renewed for a third season. So we've got a few more movies that we will bust with you guys in the new year. I hope everybody takes care. Bye, guys.